Thanks for tuning in to GameSpot Live. We're going to be talking about Rise of Nations, which is the first strategy game from a company called Big Huge Games. Maybe you haven't heard of the company, but it's being headed up by Brian Reynolds, who helped design Civilization II and Alpha Centauri, some really great strategy games with the help of Sid Meier. So Brian Reynolds went off and started his own company to work on this new game, Rise of Nations, which is a real-time strategy game that's going to try to do a lot of things differently. What's really interesting about Rise of Nations is that although it has some of the elements of standard real-time strategy game, it's also going to have elements of kind of the empire building games like Civilization. And it's also just going to have some new ideas that are kind of the result of Brian and his team saying, well, we don't like this about real-time strategy games and we want to change it. So for instance, we got to look at the resource model. And basically it's kind of similar to a lot of real-time strategy games where you can have a peasant unit and you can tell them, go here, go to this mountain, harvest some iron or some metal, and you can manage every single one if you want, but you don't have to. If you leave them idle, they'll actually get up, go off and start mining or harvesting themselves. Unlike other real-time strategy games, you can't get more resources faster just by throwing more peasants at the resource, because it turns out that each resource kind of has a limit as to how many peasants can mine it. So what you're going to want to do is expand outwards and find more mines and more sources of revenue. And this is really important in Rise of Nations because you're also going to want to build lots of extra towns, because your population limit, how many peasants and soldiers you can have and so on, are determined by how many towns you have. So it's going to be really important to just get out there, explore, find new resources, find a good place to build your town, and so on. The thing about Rise of Nations is that it's very clearly going to be about momentum. It's going to be about aggressively building and expanding your empire. Now we saw a couple of demonstrations of some of the ways that you can expand your empire in the game. You can actually build buildings on your borders, which will help push out kind of the cultural influence of your own civilization. That's important because the way it works in Rise of Nations is that your country will be bordered by the borders of your neighboring countries. So basically every time you expand, your neighbors' countries will shrink. More importantly, you're going to be able to capture your neighbors' towns. And this is going to be a really important factor in building up momentum, because unlike in other real-time strategy games where you just go to your opponent's towns and start pounding on them and eventually they're destroyed, you'll actually take them over. So in effect, when you take over a town, you'll gain a town and your opponent will lose one. As you can probably guess, this can add up really fast, especially in a multiplayer game with a couple different people playing. But towns won't be the only important thing to build in Rise of Nations, because the game is going to have 8 different ages, basically different technological eras that you can reach by developing research in one of 4 areas. That's economics, military, civics, and science. And you can research these different areas kind of in the same way that you would in a turn-based strategy game like Civilization. And what these upgrades will do is they'll give you access to kind of broad areas of technology. Rather than, a real-time strategy game like Warcraft or something where you research light armor, then medium armor, then heavy armor, or whatever, you'll just research 7 different stages of each kind of field of research, and you'll get access to several different kinds of technology. So the game won't just be about kind of the standard real-time strategy battle where you have a bunch of guys and your opponent has a bunch of guys, and they all just kind of go in and pound on each other. There are going to be tactical considerations like height advantages, and also you're going to want to place your armies intelligently. You're going to want to look for opportunities to flank and also make rear attacks. We saw a demonstration of 2 evenly matched armies that probably would have fought to a standstill, except that one of the armies divided itself into 2 groups, and one of the groups flanked the enemy army. And in that way we were actually able to pretty decisively beat the opponent in that fight. Also, when you advance through the different ages and the different types of research, you'll also be able to get one kind of top-level research project. And we saw an example of the top-level military research project, which is actually a nuclear warhead, which is pretty impressive. Nuclear warheads will just obliterate infantry units and most other units too. It turns out that the thing about nuclear warheads is it can be really tempting to want to blast your opponent to smithereens, but if your opponent also throws a nuclear warhead at you and other players start throwing around nuclear warheads, you can actually start the Armageddon clock. And when that thing counts down, everybody loses. Like we said, you can pursue these 4 different fields of research, science, military, economics, and civics. And those will basically strengthen you and your civilization in different ways. For instance, civics will help you expand your borders more quickly. These are the kind of strengths that you might kind of expect to see in a turn-based strategy game like Civilization, but the fact that they're being used against each other in a real-time strategy game is something that we kind of really haven't seen before in a game of this sort, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So even at this point, Rise of Nations looks really promising. It just looks like it's going to be a real-time strategy game that's trying hard to be a better real-time strategy game, or at least a different one. We're all looking forward to playing it when it finally comes out at the beginning of 2003.